Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Liesl Albrecht's return to Port Charles was not a gentle homecoming wrapped in tearful reunions and celebratory warmth. It was a tempest, a violent, swirling force that ripped through the town's fragile sense of peace and stability, unearthing secrets long buried beneath layers of silence, denial, and fear. Her reappearance marked the arrival of something dangerous, calculated, and unrelenting. For Nina Reeves, it felt like divine timing. Her powerful and cunning aunt had returned not a moment too soon, just as Drew Kane's grip on Willow, and by extension, on Nina's own world, had grown unbearable. With Liesl back, Nina allowed herself to breathe for the first time in weeks. She saw a path forward, a way to finally dismantle the empire of manipulation Drew had constructed, to reclaim her family, and to liberate Willow from the psychological prison that had reshaped her daughter into a stranger. In Nina's mind, Liesl wasn't just family, she was a force of nature. Intelligent, ruthless, and unwavering, Liesl had outmaneuvered some of the most dangerous men Port Charles had ever seen. She had survived betrayals, imprisonment, and loss, emerging sharper and more dangerous each time. If anyone could bring Drew to his knees, it would be Liesl. Plans began to take shape behind the scenes, information gathering, quiet meetings, whispers exchanged behind closed doors. Every word Drew spoke was analyzed. Every movement he made was catalogued. Liesl worked with methodical intensity, certain that she would expose his secrets and dismantle his power. But Drew Kane had never been a passive player. He saw further than most, read people's motives with uncanny precision, and understood that timing was everything. Long before Liesl could strike, he detected her intentions. Her return, her alliances, her subtle questions around the hospital. All of it triggered his instincts. He realized the threat she posed and made the cold, swift decision to eliminate it before it could gain traction. What Liesl didn't know was that Drew had already begun rewriting the narrative. While she laid the groundwork for her takedown strategy, he constructed an elaborate trap, one lined with falsified reports, altered medical records, and an elaborate illusion of goodwill. In a single night, everything changed. Liesl collapsed suddenly, struggling to breathe. By the time she reached the ER, her oxygen levels had dropped to dangerously low levels. The medical team worked frantically, but within hours she had slipped into a medically induced coma, unresponsive to stimuli. Drew appeared at the hospital in the wake of the emergency, his face a picture of concern. He held Nina's hand, offered his sympathies, and promised to assist in any way possible. Behind the scenes, he activated the second phase of his plan, fabricating evidence that pointed to Tracy Quartermain as the saboteur. She, after all, had questioned Drew's authority more than once and had never hidden her distrust. Framing her would both silence another skeptic and protect Drew's own position. It was a masterstroke of deception, a dual strike designed to dismantle two opponents with one perfectly orchestrated move. The brilliance of Drew's scheme lay in its subtlety. There were no explosions, no public confrontations, only quiet tragedy and well-placed lies. Liesl's medical records were altered, test results modified, her history rewritten by skilled hands operating in the hospital's data system. Dr. Portia Robinson noticed the inconsistencies almost immediately. She had grown disillusioned with Drew's increasing influence and found herself revisiting Liesl's older lab data, searching for something she couldn't yet name. The values didn't match. Hormonal patterns were off. Neurochemical baselines had shifted. Something was deeply wrong. But she lacked definitive proof, and speaking out without it could end her career, especially when Drew's reputation remained untarnished in the public eye. Nina, meanwhile, spiraled. Her faith in Drew, once rock solid, began to crack under the weight of grief and suspicion. The image of Liesl, lying still and pale amidst blinking machines, haunted her. How could she have misjudged everything so badly? And yet, a part of her clung to denial. Accepting that Drew had orchestrated such a horrific betrayal would mean acknowledging her own complicity in giving him power. It would mean admitting that Willow's decline, Liesl's collapse, Tracy's disgrace, none of it had been accidental. So Nina lived in a suspended state of disbelief, her heart pulling in one direction, her instincts in another, paralyzed by the fear of what the truth would demand of her. As Drew continued to play the grieving ally, Jason Morgan began his own quiet inquiry. He had always harbored doubts about Drew, ever since their tangled past as brothers with overlapping identities. But this was different. Drew's behavior was too perfect, too polished. His sudden eagerness to help, to assist in the investigation into Liesl's collapse, felt like overcompensation. Jason began to comb through the hospital's secure data logs. Late one night, he uncovered something chilling. A line of code buried deep in the access logs, a backdoor login used under an alias Drew had employed years ago during covert WSB assignments. It had been used to alter patient records shortly before Liesl's collapse. Jason didn't speak a word to anyone. He knew better than to strike without leverage. Instead, he began building a case in silence, collecting fragments, mapping connections, following Drew's carefully concealed footprints through digital shadows. Drew, unaware that Jason was watching, grew bolder. He offered to help Tracy navigate the legal accusations against her, feeding her falsified data as proof of her innocence while reinforcing the illusion of his own righteousness. He manipulated media narratives, subtly shifting public sympathy toward himself. His control over Willow deepened, her behavior becoming more erratic as her sense of reality continued to fray. And all the while, the one person capable of exposing him, Liesl, remained comatose, her body held hostage by the very hospital she had trusted. The tragedy was not just in Drew's betrayal, but in the effectiveness of his mask. Few questioned him. Even fewer dared to speak against him. And those who did, like Portia and Jason, knew that one wrong move could put them in Liesl's place. But something had changed in Portia. She wasn't the same woman who had once looked the other way to protect her job. She was now staring down the barrel of a moral crisis, and this time, she was determined not to blink. Her silence was becoming unbearable. With every passing hour, the weight of complicity threatened to crush her. She knew she couldn't keep this secret forever. Eventually, she would have to make a choice, stay safe and remain part of the cover-up, or risk everything to bring Drew Kane down. And so the chessboard of Port Charles remained in motion. Pieces shifting, players emerging, and the shadow of one man's ambition threatening to engulf them all. Liesl's return had been the catalyst, the storm that stirred the waters. But now, she lay in stillness, and it was up to those left standing to decide whether the truth would rise, or be buried with her. At the very heart of the power struggle gripping Port Charles stood Willow, a woman once known for her calm strength and unwavering resilience. But now, she was unraveling, fraying at the edges of her mind in ways that alarmed even those closest to her. She had become a shadow of herself, quick-tempered, emotionally withdrawn, haunted by sleepless nights that left her exhausted and volatile. Her once warm presence was replaced by a cold detachment, her once fluid voice now hesitant and flat. Friends and colleagues chalked it up to stress or the lingering trauma of her illness, but those explanations didn't come close to capturing the gravity of what was truly happening inside her. The transformation wasn't just psychological, it was almost like her identity had been subtly reprogrammed. Liesl Albrecht had warned her, before her mysterious collapse, that Drew Kane was manipulating her, controlling her mind and emotions in ways she hadn't yet realized. At the time, Willow couldn't grasp the weight of those words. They sounded like paranoia, remnants of old vendettas and mistrust. But now, every moment of confusion, every restless night, every inexplicable panic felt like pieces of a sinister puzzle slowly clicking into place. She had become hyper-aware of her surroundings. The flicker of her phone's camera lens felt like an eye watching her. The security system in her apartment beeped at irregular hours. Even the digital voice assistant on her nightstand occasionally activated without prompting. At first, she thought she was imagining things, but the sensation never went away. It only deepened. She began to fear her own reflection, convinced that someone, or something, was always watching. Her privacy felt invaded. Her inner thoughts no longer felt safe. It was as if her very consciousness was under siege. Despite her growing unease, Willow couldn't bring herself to speak openly to Nina. There had been a time when Nina was her confidant, her surrogate mother, her fierce protector. But that connection had withered. Nina now carried a haunted look, her eyes hollow, her spirit dimmed. The woman who once burned with passionate certainty now walked through her days with an eerie absence, as if a piece of her had been stolen. Willow could see it clearly. Drew's betrayal had carved a hollow space in Nina's soul. And so, in her fear, Willow kept quiet. How could she confide in someone who seemed just as lost? One night, in a surge of desperation, Willow fled her home and went to Carly's doorstep, trembling and out of breath. Her heart was pounding, her hands shaking. Carly had always been steady, unwavering, a rock in times of chaos. But when Carly opened the door, Willow couldn't form the words. She tried to speak, to say something, anything, but the thoughts tangled in her throat. Her eyes darted around nervously, as if Drew himself were hiding just behind the walls. Her breathing became erratic, her body frozen in indecision. And then, just as suddenly, she turned and ran, retreating into the night like a ghost chased by her own fears. In that moment, she realized she could no longer trust anyone, not even the people she once believed would never let her down. Elsewhere, deep in the sterile corridors of General Hospital, Dr. Portia Robinson was following a hunch that refused to leave her alone. Liesel's abrupt medical crisis had troubled her from the beginning. The symptoms didn't align with anything natural. The decline had been too rapid, too clean, too deliberate. Something was wrong, and Portia couldn't shake the thought that it hadn't been an accident. Quietly, under the radar, she retrieved Liesel's archived blood panels from her previous checkups and compared them to the ones collected during her recent collapse. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled through the data on the screen. The discrepancies were alarming. The cellular breakdown patterns were atypical, and certain markers that had been present for years were now mysteriously absent. Intrigued and terrified, Portia sent the samples for deeper analysis. Using a private lab outside the hospital to avoid detection. The results came back with a name she hadn't seen in years, Vesperazine 9, an experimental neurotoxin developed in clandestine research, never approved for use, and nearly impossible to trace. It was engineered to suppress neural activity gradually, creating symptoms of deep fatigue and eventual unconsciousness without altering most standard blood markers. In simple terms, it was the perfect weapon to neutralize someone without leaving forensic evidence. Portia sat in stunned silence as she read the final report. Liesl hadn't suffered an organic collapse, she had been poisoned with intent and precision. Someone had injected this toxin into her bloodstream and done so in a way that mimicked a natural health event. The implications were staggering. Only someone with extensive medical knowledge and access to private pharmaceutical channels could have pulled it off. And only someone with high-level hospital clearance could have manipulated the records afterward to cover it up. One name kept coming back to her, Drew Kane. The idea chilled her. Drew was seen as a hero, a humanitarian. He had connections across every institution in town. And yet, he had the background, the motive, and the means. Portia knew she had stumbled into something much larger than herself, something dangerous. Her instincts screamed for her to act, but the consequences loomed large. Speaking out meant exposing herself to backlash. It meant admitting she had seen Drew's increasing influence and said nothing. It meant putting her career, her safety, and even her daughter's future at risk. Portia found herself standing at a moral crossroads, her conscience screaming louder with every passing hour. She wasn't just holding a lab report. She was holding the truth. A truth that could bring down Drew Kane's carefully curated empire of lies, but only if she had the courage to share it. She looked at Liesel's unconscious form through the glass of the ICU, the woman who had once seemed indestructible now rendered silent by science and malice. And in that moment, she understood that silence was no longer an option. If she didn't speak up, no one else would. And if Drew could do this to Liesl, he could do it again. To anyone. Even to Willow. Portia took a deep breath and turned away from the monitor, the truth weighing heavy in her chest. She didn't know how she would do it, or who would believe her. But she did know one thing: Drew Kane had made a fatal mistake. He had underestimated the women around him. And one by one, they were waking up. Even if Liesl's body remained still, the storm she had brought was far from over. Port Charles was on the edge of a reckoning, and Portia might be the only one brave enough to light the fuse. Jason Morgan, a man who had long mastered the art of moving in silence and striking when least expected, now found himself racing against a ticking clock. The chaos simmering beneath the calm facade of Port Charles had reached a boiling point, and while most of the town remained oblivious, Jason had seen the cracks forming in Drew Kane's perfectly sculpted image. The once admired war hero and philanthropist had spent months weaving a false narrative, one that positioned him as the unwavering protector of Willow, the victim of Tracy's imagined vendetta, the benevolent fiancé standing firm in the face of crisis. But Jason saw what others refused to see. He saw the too-perfect timing of Liesl Albrecht's collapse. He noticed the eerie synchronicity between Willow's psychological unraveling and Drew's growing legal influence over her life. He recognized the glint in Drew's eyes, not of compassion, but of calculation. Piece by piece, Jason reconstructed the timeline. He gathered hospital system access logs and matched them to timestamps when Drew was, off the record, in the building. He interviewed orderlies and tech staff who had seen Drew enter restricted areas with forged clearance. He quietly accessed the hospital's internal audit trail and discovered a trail of unauthorized entries into Liesl's medical history, all traced back to a spoofed ID, a digital fingerprint Jason knew belonged to Drew from their shared WSB history. But evidence, even damning, meant little without someone to expose it. And the town was still deeply under Drew's spell. Even Nina, as much as she was unraveling emotionally, could not bring herself to face the truth. She was drowning in self-doubt, emotionally paralyzed, and too ashamed to admit that the man she once championed had become a monster hiding in plain sight. The deeper Jason dug, the more sinister the picture became. The erased security footage, now partially recovered, revealed Drew entering Liesl's lab late at night. The gloves, the uniform, the posture, it was him. Even with the low resolution, there was no mistaking it. Another video, this time from a hallway adjacent to the hospital pharmacy, showed Drew meeting with an unknown courier in a shadowed corner, exchanging a small vial marked with a coded batch number. Jason tracked that number to a discontinued neurotoxin previously flagged by a medical ethics board for its potential use in psychological warfare. This wasn't coincidence. It was premeditated attack. As the day of the wedding drew closer, Jason's urgency intensified. Drew had fast-tracked the ceremony with unsettling efficiency. The marriage was to take place in a small, nondescript chapel on the hospital's private floor, with a hand-selected officiant and minimal witnesses. Willow, visibly frail and disoriented, had barely been consulted. According to hospital records Jason uncovered, Drew had begun assembling documentation that would not only grant him legal guardianship over Willow's affairs post-marriage but also full medical proxy rights, meaning he could make binding decisions about her treatment, her visitation rights with Wiley, and her access to psychiatric evaluation. Worse, Jason discovered that Drew had orchestrated a recommendation from the hospital's Internal Behavioral Review Board claiming Willow was showing signs of early-stage dissociative identity disorder, another manufactured diagnosis built from falsified reports, suspicious psychologist notes, and manipulated behavioral data. Drew was building a fortress of control, and every brick was laid with deception. If Jason didn't act now, Willow would become a prisoner in her own mind, with Drew holding the key. On the night before the wedding, Jason made his move. He contacted Carly and Portia, two people whose instincts and courage he trusted. Together, they reviewed the evidence, Liesl's original toxicology report salvaged from a hidden folder in the backup server, the falsified behavioral assessments, and the full recovered surveillance video showing Drew tampering with Liesl's lab equipment. Portia's face turned pale as she confirmed the drug traces in Liesl's system matched the compound in the video. There was no doubt anymore, Drew had orchestrated the entire collapse and planted evidence to frame Tracy. They agreed that the only way to stop Drew was to expose him publicly, at the wedding, where he'd least expect it. Jason knew he'd have only one shot. As Drew prepared for the quiet ceremony, donning a custom-tailored suit and greeting the few selected guests with a calm, rehearsed smile, Jason waited in the shadows, evidence drive in hand, his expression steeled by resolve. And then, just as the ceremony was about to begin, a soft commotion stirred in the ICU. Nurses gathered outside Liesl Albrecht's room, whispering frantically. Monitors had started beeping erratically. Vitals were fluctuating. And then, miraculously, Liesl's eyes opened. Slowly, weakly, but with clarity. Her fingers twitched, her breathing stabilized, and her voice, though faint, was coherent. "Nina," she whispered. "Stop him." The news spread like a wildfire. Jason reached Liesl's room seconds later and looked into her eyes. She didn't need to explain. He already knew. But the fact that she was alive and awake, conscious enough to testify, meant Drew's plans were unraveling. Jason handed Portia the drive and asked her to prepare a press statement. Meanwhile, Carly, acting on instinct, intercepted the wedding coordinator and requested a delay, citing last-minute logistics. Drew, annoyed but controlled, stepped aside to take a call, only to be greeted by silence, followed by a distorted voice delivering a warning, "The truth is awake, Drew. Time's up."